like we have to finally have the Kemba Walker conversation that we've been skirting around all year.
I thought I had it a couple of weeks ago, but we can go into it. I mean, my stance hasn't changed. I think you need to get off of him right now.
This was already shaping up to be a fascinating offseason for the Celtics, and now given the leadership change, Brad Stevens, I don't want to say he's inheriting a mess necessarily, but he's inheriting a complicated situation. They are probably either going to be right bumping up against the tax, or if Jason Tatum makes an all-NBA team, they're already going to be over the luxury tax threshold.
Yeah.
They have to, they traded for Evan Fournier at the trade deadline, used a big part of that trade exception. He's a free agent.
And who wants $20 million per year to return.
And then you also have, you've got Marcus Smart heading into the last year of his deal. They have Tatum and Jaylen Brown are locked up on contracts through the next 3 seasons. So you've got your foundational pieces in place. But now it's a matter of filling out the roster around them. Yep. And more, before we go into free agency, I feel like we have to finally have the Kemba Walker conversation that we've been skirting around all year.
I thought I had it a couple of weeks ago, but we can go into it. I mean, my stance hasn't changed. I think you need to get off of him right now. I only think this is going to get worse. This could be a Blake Griffin thing moving forward. Who was it who recently from The Athletic? Was it Jared Weiss? I think, who reported earlier today that Kemba Walker league-wide still has negative trade value.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, no, I think it was Jared, friend of the podcast, in fact. I remember he was on at one point, who reported that, I believe. And that basically you would have to give up something to get off of Kemba. He is not a positive asset.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask, because... Yeah. I mean, he missed the last 2 games of the playoff series against the Nets with this knee that has been bothering him basically all year. He only played 43 regular season games as well. The production just wasn't quite there. Okay, fine, he averages like 19.5 assists, 4 rebounds, but just, I don't know. That wasn't like the Kemba Walker that they signed to a max contract. It wasn't the caliber of play that they were hoping to get from him.
Not even close. And look, that knee is bothering him. He's still a very, very small dude as well. This could get ugly, because if you lose your quickness and all that, and you're like 6 foot nothing, Brian, I mean, then defensively you're also going to be more than just a step behind. Then you're going to be small and slow. You can't be both in today's league. The fact that his knee is an issue would also mean moving forward that he won't be able to create as much separation off the dribble. And again, as someone who is that small, what do you really need to do in order to create your own shot? Well, you need to gain separation. So this could get ugly really, really quickly. So if there is a team out there completely desperate for point guard play, who is very short-sighted, really doesn't have great management, trade him to them.
Well, would you do it? I guess from the Celtics perspective, would you give up assets to get off of him? And from another team's perspective, how much would you want to take him on? He's owed $36 million next year, $37.7 million player option in 22-23, which, if the knee continues to bother him to this extent, I think you have to go in assuming that he's going to pick that up.
If I'm a different team and the Celtics call me and they go, would you take on Kemba Walker? Like, we know you have cap space. Will you absorb Kemba Walker's contract? Mm-hmm. I'm asking for Robert Williams.
Interesting.
At the very least, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it. I said that and it didn't even feel as though that was enough.
Yeah, I don't think it is, because Robert Williams is up for an extension right now.
Yeah, he is. Aaron Nesmith as well, maybe? I don't know. I would ask for more. I would ask for quite a lot, because it's not just the $36 million next season. It's the $37.6 million the year after, because that's a player option. He's not going to turn that down. He'd be crazy to. That is over $73 million over the next 2 seasons.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to get a substantial amount of assets back. And I think Robert Williams, just because he finally broke out a little bit, like he looks like a keeper. But yeah, you're right. Given that he's up for an extension, then he's no longer a bargain deal, at least not a year into it after. So that would be Aaron Nesmith. Romeo Langford isn't good enough to warrant that. Maybe even an additional draft pick. I mean, it's $73 million. That's a lot.
Yeah. I mean, they have the 16 pick in this year's draft. I can pull up their real GM page. I'm guessing they have most, if not all, of their future picks as well. So they have assets to use to get off of that. Yeah, they only owe a couple second rounders to Charlotte. Yep. So yeah, I mean they've got all their first round picks for the next 7 years. So they have flexibility if they want to get off that contract. And I think I agree with you. They need to at least explore it. I mean, if they don't have confidence that Kemba is going to get back to what he was a couple seasons ago, if this knee problem is just going to be chronic for the rest of his career, this is the problem with having 3 max guys. It gets really hard. Once you have those 3 guys on big contracts, it gets exceptionally difficult to fill out the roster around them. You just don't have a ton of avenues to do so. And this is where the Celtics are at. You know, they can package Marcus Smart in a Kemba deal to get off of him, but Marcus Smart only has 1 year left on his contract, and he's like the heart and soul of that team. So, you know, you're going to be losing a lot if you give him up. I found this Jared Weiss column that you referenced. It says multiple front office sources say they still view Walker as having negative trade value. That likely means the trade would cost the Celtics extra picks or assets to offload. He mentioned apparently the Thunder have come up several times as a good fit for a potential salary dump, especially with the idea of Al Horford returning to Boston. So that's interesting, I guess. But again, if I'm OKC, I'm saying, sure, I'll do that deal, but you have to give me the 16 pick this year. I would ask for Robert Williams if I'm OKC, because they've got plenty of money to spend, and he's young enough that he could actually fit in, long term next to SGA, and that's probably just the starting point. Yeah.
How long does Horford have remaining? 2 years.
2 years as well, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. You know what? Then I wouldn't do it if I'm Boston. I understand getting off of Kemba, but I wouldn't. I think it's time they lay off the old guys, Brian.
Yeah, that's certainly fair. Fournier is the other big decision they have to make this offseason, at least in terms of their roster next year. You're saying he's looking for around $20 million, which will just put them well into the luxury tax. And again, considering how it becomes increasingly punitive the further you go over. So once you're about 15 million over, that's where you start to get into hold your nose territory a little bit. One of the tricky things about this offseason is Tatum as well. If he makes that All-NBA team, he's going to get a $5.6 million raise. So he would push them into the tax already. Yeah. So I almost think it depends on whether that happens with regard to how much you'd be willing to spend to retain Fournier. But what's your walkaway price if you're Boston on Evan Fournier?
20 probably. I mean, I think that's a little rich for someone who scores and shoots but does virtually nothing else. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he isn't a great floor spacer. I'm also not going to sit here and pretend like he didn't have COVID. I know people will point to his stats and go, well, see, 20 million. I understand that he's worth a substantial amount of money because of his scoring prowess, and his current statistics that you read about aren't really representative of who he is. At the same time, though, I just don't think 20 million for a guy like him is, at this point, a smart idea for the Celtics. I just don't. I understand the shooting aspect. I do. But you know what? Then I would rather take that money and spend them elsewhere and cross my fingers and hope that Aaron Nesmith is going to turn into that. Besides, Nesmith actually showed a little bit more defensive upside, I think, compared to what Evan Fournier, who's 28, 29? 28, will be 29 by next season. I mean, there's no defensive upside there with Fournier. Nesmith there is, so pivot on to Nesmith, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's tricky because Fournier, in terms of what you're right, he brings shooting to the table. He shot 46.3% from three-point range, and he played 16 regular season games with the Celtics, so small sample size, but he's a career almost 38% three-point shooter, and I feel like they acquired him to fill into that Hayward role.
Yeah.
But he just isn't as good of a player as Gordon Hayward, and when you have Brown and Tatum, I understand you just want as many wings who can do a lot of things as possible.
Right.
But I just don't know that Fournier is the same caliber of player. So you're right. When you've got an Aaron Nesmith signed to 3 more years at a reasonable rate, Fournier feels like a luxury more than a necessity at this point. But I almost wonder, it could be good in a way that they're transitioning from Ainge to Stevens right now, because I almost wonder if Ainge was the one still making that decision, if he would be more inclined to not necessarily overpay Fournier, but give him $20 million or even a little bit more than that, just to make sure that spending the trade exception on him doesn't come back to look like a mistake. Whereas whereas Stevens could just say, you know what, blank slate, fresh start. We get that we used it on, we've got still like 11 or so million of that trade exception, but we used a grand majority of it on Evan Fournier. Oh, well, it didn't work out. We're moving on.
Yeah. I think that's a smart play if that's the price tag. Maybe they get together and they figure out something else. I really love the deal that he was on, the $17 million a year. Evan Fournier, I think that is reasonable, right? I mean, for someone who comes in and can give you roughly 20 points per game on great shooting, isn't that like 17 million worth?
Yeah, I think at that price, but again, this is where, we're going into next year now. Look ahead to 2022. Robert Williams, if we don't sign him to an extension, he'll be a restricted free agent. Marcus Smart is also coming off the books. And again, if you can get off of Kemba, you suddenly have the money to make these types of things work.
Yeah.
But if you can't, then you've got Kemba at 37.7, Jaylen Brown at 27.2, Jason Tatum at 30.4. Those 3 guys alone are almost $90 million, more than $90 million in cap space. And then if you're bringing Fournier back at, 15, 20 million, you're already like close to bumping up against next year's cap, and you have to worry about Smart and Robert Williams as well. So it's just, this is, part of what makes roster building in the NBA so difficult, is that if you don't maximize the windows when you have guys on rookie contracts and they outperform those deals, and they, that you want a Tatum and a Brown to develop into max caliber players, and they did, but once they get onto those contracts, all of a sudden it's just a lot more, like you're pretty much going to be limited most years to a mid-level exception, and maybe the biannual if you're under the tax. But other than that, you have to be really smart about your draft picks and your minimum signings. Like, you need to hit on a Bryn Forbes rather than spending 2-year non-taxpayer mid-level exception for Tristan Thompson, which looked like just an immediate mistake.
Maybe that's the play. That's actually an interesting angle. So they have all their young guys, but they also have young guys who you don't really know moving forward for main, keepers, like Romeo Langford, for example. Like, what is he? Grant Williams, like, sure. Semi Ojeleye is probably not going to be returning at all. Like, there are some decisions to make about that group of players that have underwhelmed. Maybe it's just like gauge the trade market with those guys. See if there are teams out there who are like, oh we believe in Romeo Langford. Let's give up something for Romeo Langford, and they get off of those contracts, and then they just use those roster spots to getting minimum contract veterans in, because it's not a problem when you mix and match veterans with young guys, assuming, of course, that the veterans don't take up the same amount of cap space as Kemba freaking Walker. That was always their problem. It was that they dedicated that much salary to veterans when they had Tatum and Brown on the roster. Like, again, it's fine to mix and match, but don't go out of your way to sign someone who's like 10 years older to a major deal. It just doesn't make sense. Find the old guys for cheap. Go out and identify like the locker room guys, like the Garrett Temples, the Ed Davises, well, he's not playing anymore, but the Vince Carters, you know what I mean, right? Those type of people. Get them for like $3 to $5 million if you have to go above the min, and then spend the rest of your money on players who are age appropriate to Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Problem freaking solved.
Yeah. Easier said than done, but
is it though? Is it though? Like, yeah, right now you could say it's difficult because they're in that situation that they built for themselves, but it was always dumb. You and I were harping on this for the day that they actually got Gordon Hayward. We were like, why? This doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hate to keep bringing it back to the failed sign and trade for Hayward, but how much better would the Celtics team look right now if you had Miles Turner signed to, how much is at least another couple of years on his deal, right?
He does.
Two more years at $18 million a pop.
Right. That's not a bad contract whatsoever. It's fine. That's what I'm talking about, Brian. That's the good contracts. Those are like he's on a non-rookie contract, so he's obviously into his extension, but he's young enough to be on the same timeline as Jaylen Brown, as Jason Tatum. That's how you spend that money. You don't go in and get guys who suddenly drops off while the other guys are like ascending. It just makes no sense because you're losing out on a trade asset. But by having those old guys play that much of a role and clog up that much of the cap space, because then when those guys are so old that they can't really play anymore, you have to get rid of them. Then Jaylen and Jason are already into their extensions, so they're taking up so much cap space that you can't really afford to go out and find another key piece. Like team building, I understand what you're saying, easier said than done, but overall, team construction shouldn't be that difficult. It's about understanding timelines and financials. I mean, that's team building 101.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think the problem, as Boston has seen in recent years, is that it only takes one team to screw up your plans. Right. So like Al Horford a couple of years ago, he turns down that player option. We're like, oh, that's weird, but maybe he's going to sign a longer term deal. Yeah. And then in come the Sixers, who offer him more money than the Celtics were comfortable paying him. And all of a sudden that you just like they've hemorrhaged marquee talent between Kyrie, Horford, and Hayward.
Right.
And don't have much, if anything, to show for it right now.
No, you're absolutely right. But at the same time, they didn't know at that point in time that Jason and Jaylen in particular would be this good, I think they had an inclination about it, especially from Tatum's perspective. But the fact that they became this good and then they still end up signing Kemba Walker a couple years ago, that to me was egregious. Like, why would you go out and get someone at that age group? Like, when we talked about it, we said at the same time, I remember when we talked about it, it was, we think he was going to be an upgrade over Kyrie from a player, or not a player perspective, but a locker room perspective and a leading perspective and all of that. But the age was a concern. Like, it just didn't align from an age perspective. It had to hit home. It had to be the exact right signing. He had to stay healthy. Now we're in a situation 2 years later, he's not fully healthy. You can see his age. You can see his cap number, how much like that's going to sting by having to give it up. So they need to do something else now. They need to get off of that contract. And I'm not saying by any means necessary, but they need to get something aligned. If they waste the primes of Brown and Tatum, good Lord.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm not all gloom and doom here because I think there are ways to do it. But, you know, 3 years left on Jaylen Brown's contract. It's not an infinite amount of time. Like Tatum, you've got locked up for a long time.
Yeah.
This window with Brown and Tatum is not as long as it might otherwise feel. But
2024, you're right, 3 years.
Yeah. But look, they've had a ton of success with those two guys as the centerpieces already. I'm not ruling out the Celtics as becoming, back into that top tier of Eastern Conference contender if Kemba can get back to what he was before, if they can retain Fournier, or if they flip Kemba for something else, sign and trade Fournier somewhere else. There are options here.
Yeah.
But it's a lot for a first-time president of basketball operations. So Godspeed, Brad Stevens. If you felt burnt out as a coach, you are inheriting quite a mess right now.
One final question before we move on from the Celtics to you, Brian, because I'm curious just to where you're standing on this. I understand. I brought him up earlier, Robert Williams. I think he's tremendous, but he's obviously not on the level of Tatum or Brown. If you're Brad Stevens and you're looking at this roster, is there not only two keepers? And you could argue on the bubble Marcus Smart, but you just don't know what he's trying to command for next contract. But push comes to shove. If you just start the roster over, it's Tatum and Brown and no one else, right?
Yeah, I think you can make an argument. I wouldn't say I'm definitely getting off of some of the young guys, but I don't think any of them have cemented themselves as this could be the third piece of a big three with Tatum and Brown.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. You can probably survive getting rid of every single player on the roster but those two, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's actually, you brought it up in terms of getting off of Kemba's contract. Maybe that's the pill you swallow this summer. Maybe you just go, okay, Romeo Langford, Grant Williams, number 16, take it. Mm-hmm. Or someone else, maybe even Robert Williams or whatever. Just take it. Get out of Kemba's contract, get clean books, start a little bit afresh with just Tatum and Brown, and you just go, we build from there. That's our priority. And every decision that we make from there on is tailored around those two.
Yeah, totally agree there.